Welcome to people across the world to Who Are We Now? Beyond COVID-19 to Trade and Exchange. My name's Natasha Cheacher and I'm Director of Change Consultancy Capacity Org. And before we begin, I'd like to really deeply thank the people who made, the organisations who made this event possible, the British Council and also the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also to very warmly thank our official partners for this series of two conversations, this being the second, and they are Griffith Review in Brisbane and the Australian National University in Canberra. I'd like to begin the formal proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I am tonight and of the lands in which all participants in this event are located this evening, including the audience. I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past, present and emerging, and also the great privilege of living and working on the lands they have cared for so long. Before we get into the conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that the chat function has been deactivated for the purpose of this webinar, but you in the audience may use the question and answer, the Q&A function, and we'll respond to those questions. So pop them in and we'll save them up. We'll respond to those questions in around an hour and you can direct them either to specific panellists or the larger whole. And please also note that this conversation and any questions that you post are being recorded so that we can share the event with people who aren't able to attend this evening. So now we'll begin. It's my extremely great pleasure to introduce you to a panel who I have described as internationally agile, even though nobody can really go anywhere at the moment. Three of them are in Canberra and one of them is in London. I'm in Hobart, Tasmania. The first is Her Excellency Vicky Treadle, who is the British High Commissioner to Australia, and it's a very, very great privilege to welcome you tonight, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Natasha, but please do call me Vicky.
I just did. Thank you. And our next guest is Professor Sally Wheeler, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of International Strategy at the Australian National University. Thank you, Sally. And our third speaker is Professor Frank Bongiorno, who's Professor of History at the Australian National University. And our fourth speaker, coming from London, is Hans van Looyen, who is an Australian who is currently the Europe correspondent with the Australian Financial Review. So, now we're all in the same Zoom room. I'll start with Vicky, because Vicky, the question on everyone's lips this week, it's been a quite big week for Australia in its relationship with the UK, is AUKUS. And I never dreamt when we were putting this topic together that questions around trade and exchange would include questions around nuclear-powered submarines. But I'm wondering if you'd like to open by making a comment about that and setting the scene for the larger conversation that we want to have.
Well, for those observers of Britain's foreign policy and indeed our place in the world since our departure from the European Union, hopefully you read our integrated review that we published earlier this year. In that it made clear that whilst we are a Euro-Atlantic country and the security and defense of Europe is a priority for us, we also recognize that the center of gravity in terms of geoeconomics, geostrategy are shifting to the Indo-Pacific. So we need to engage in this part of the world from an economic trade, people-to-people link, because this part of the world really matters. And in that we set out that we would be building and developing our partnerships with long-standing allies, of course Australia, but countries like Japan, our ambitions to join ASEAN as a dialogue partner status. So I would put this latest trilateral arrangement that we have with the US and Australia within that strategic context. But I would also say this, that putting the submarine contract to one side, because that is a matter for the Australian government in terms of their requirements for future capability. And we're very happy to be a supportive partner in looking and scoping an alternative nuclear-powered propelled option for Australia. that we see this as an important relationship for both Australia and the United Kingdom. The United States is our #1 defence and security partner. So it makes sense over the decades that we have had this close relationship to look at what the three of us can do together in terms of the capabilities that we need in this century. So that is what the announcements a week ago today are about, how we can work together to deliver the capabilities that we need for a safer, secure world, and working with historic partners to do so. This is not mutually exclusive. As we develop the work on this, we will look at how we work with other partners where we have common interests, because it is about the long-term strategic direction that we are taking and the importance of this region.
Thank you. Hans, would you like to jump in there? Because I know this will have been top of your mind in the last week as well. Is there anything you'd like to say about?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that sort of struck me, without sort of going into a detailed analysis one way or another, is what's it like? It's like having a sort of pair of bifocal lenses on to look at this issue from here, because, you know, when you talk to anyone in Australia or you look at the Australian coverage, it's like, well, this is a no-brainer. Of course we need this submarine. Of course we need this relationship. Of course we need this alliance. You know, nothing to see here. But then when you sort of, you know, when you turn your gaze to Paris and to a lesser extent Brussels and some of the other European capitals, it's a kind of, you know, diplomatic outrage of the like that hasn't been seen in the transatlantic relationship and by extension with Australia since the Iraq War in 2003. So it's very strange to have these kind of, you know, these two worlds that I'm sort of moving between, and so in that sense, perhaps one shouldn't be so surprised that Australia and perhaps Britain and certainly America are so surprised, because it feels like a kind of perception of how the world is and should be, or you know, or what the baseline assumptions in our relationship are, was the starting point, and perhaps there wasn't as much understanding of each other's starting point all along as there may have been. So I don't really want to sort of make a comment either way on the rights and wrongs of it, of course, because I'm just reporting on it. But as an initial observation, it's just interesting how jarring it's been to see it from two different perspectives.
Well, sitting from where I'm obviously not a diplomat and I'm obviously not a geostrategic analyst, but one thing that strikes me is how simplistic a lot of the sound bites have been around it in the last week. So I'd like to move away from the simple sound bites and take us all in a deep dive into nuance and complexities, because one of the things I really love about Britain and also about Australia and the relationship between us is we are complicated entities, and those complications evolve over time. So one of the things that all the panelists and I have in common is that we've spent chunks of our professional life in Australia and chunks of our professional life in Britain, and so have, if you like, as a personal and professional experiment, oscillated between these two nodes. So I'd really love it if we could unpack some of that nuance and those complexities around that relationship moving forward. So I'll come to Sally next. Sally, you work as a leader in one of Australia's leading universities in international strategy in the higher education space at a time where, to put it bluntly, your supply of student talent has dried up because our borders are closed. Would you like to talk about what that means for Australia and Britain in terms of that evolving relationship I just alluded to? As part of this UK AU season, the British Council did a really interesting higher education roundtable 2 nights ago, where there were sector leaders who started to talk about that. But you're really at a quite difficult coalface. Would you like to say something about that and where you see it going for us? All of it?
I mean, I think it's important to recognise that we still have, Australia still has thousands of students studying with it overseas. and thousands of international students who still want to come to Australia and are still enrolling for Australian qualifications. But I think one of the things we perhaps forget is that a rite of passage for a lot of students has been to go overseas for a semester or for a year, and that has dried up. Lots of students will have started their degree thinking, to Italy for a semester, I want to go to France for a year, it's an integral part of my plans, etc. I think the closure of Australian borders has been very hard on our own domestic students from that point of view, and also from the point of view of having an international classroom. I mean, many of us have taught international classrooms. Many of us, when we were students, were in international classrooms. And that's a deeply enriching experience. And I think that has been a huge loss. Obviously, there are implications for our business model going forward. I think trips to Europe for students have always been more popular for Australians going out, the figures would show us, than for Americans or for US or for UK students coming in. Maybe the future is integrated programs between our universities, but we have to recognise that, you know, Australia traditionally has 4-year degrees, the UK has 3-year degrees. Our academic years start in different places. There would be a lot of work to do to make those things happen other than by exception, which is how they happen at the moment. I mean, Frank has spent a long time at King's and has brought ANU lots of links with King's London. I don't know whether you agree with me or not, that you can do these trans-world, international education things, but doing them at scale is very, very hard.
I'd like to go to Frank on that. You know, I'm an alumna of King's as well, so it's very deeply embedded in my heart and my experience. You know, my experience as you described, Sally, when I left after I finished ANU, I went to King's, and it was such a seamless thing to do. That's going back to 1991, so it was less seamless than in 2019, but it was still, there was never any question that one wouldn't be able to do it. So, Frank, could you talk to that experience and your own perspective as an established Australian academic?
Yeah, so, I mean, I did work at King's as an ordinary academic over there. I mean, it was essentially a permanent job. I mean, I think that kind of mobility was very taken for granted for a very long time. I mean, really, between the rise of the jumbo jet, I guess, in the 1960s, and a couple of years ago, it was already, I think, fraying at the edges a little bit. I think we were starting to have conversations in universities about sustainability and the possibilities of excessive international travel and the impacts of that on the environment and all the rest of it. So I think even before COVID, there were questions being asked about that kind of easy mobility. I remember there was a period of, I don't know, about 18 months towards the end of my time at King's where I did the trip to Australia about 6 times. And that kind of thing was completely taken for granted, I think, at that stage. That is going to become more difficult for academics and students, I think. I mean, again, Sally will have a better notion of this than me, but my sense is that a lot of international student mobility takes for granted the fact that you don't simply go to a university for several years, but you'll go backwards and forwards. Now, that's probably less the case with students who are going on more short-term exchanges. My sense would be that has become a very important part of the university education for many students. Obviously, it's easier for some than others. It has financial costs, but my impression as a teacher at the ANU is that students had come to take that for granted, that you would do that for 6 or 12 months or for a semester or two during the course of your studies. It was clearly an enriching experience. Not all of them, of course, went to the UK, but many did. We had students who went to King's. We had students who went to Some have gone to Leeds, to Sheffield, and so on. Others went to Ireland, and of course, others go to the United States, or indeed closer to home, perhaps in Asia. But nonetheless, that has become a part of the university experience, and that's something that is impossible at the moment. And at least uncertain, I think, for the foreseeable future. I mean, it could be much more expensive. It will certainly have a more difficult regulatory environment around it. I think all of those kinds of things are going to be, certainly as universities, we're going to have to grapple with them. Yeah.
Well, and indeed, not simply students, it's also people working in the culture space, which again is very pertinent to the British Council, people working in business. I mean, trade depends on, people sell people, someone once said to me. And I feel like there's only so far that Zoom can take us, wonderful as it is. So I'm just flipping back. This series of conversations builds on an issue of Griffith Review that was published last year called The European Exchange, which I co-edited with Ashley Hay. And one of the great pieces in there is by an Australian called Matt Schultz, who's from Wagga and now lives in Poland. And he, with his partner Gosha, runs a music festival called Unsound. And his piece is really worth the read, because in that piece, he talked about this question of what if we can't get on the planes anymore. And at the end of my conversation with him, we agreed the worst possible thing that could happen in both our lives was not being able to get on planes. I'll flip over to Vicky on this, because obviously there are really big questions about carbon footprints, climate change. Should we have been getting on those planes all the time? Should we get back on them? How does that fit into that corner of what's a very interesting dialogue between Britain and Australia as well, as part of a global dialogue, which has become, to my mind, almost as pressing as COVID now in terms of people's consciousness?
Well, I think when aviation technology was first developed, like all technology, if we go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, wonderful technology that transformed the world, no one understood what the climate impact would be. So we live in a different time now, and we have that knowledge. And global connectivity is really important. People-to-people connections are really important, whether for education, whether for business and industry, or just the business of government and diplomacy. So as we look to the future, making judgments on the recent past when we were not necessarily equipped with that knowledge. And there is a lot that you can do to offset. You can plant trees, all of those big corporations, airlines are looking at what they can do on that. The real agenda, and wearing our sort of COP26 presidency hat, is what are the future technologies? And if we're looking at connectivity, green aviation, green marine, green transport, of course, of all the technologies, road transport and electric vehicles are at the forefront of that. But right now, people are developing, green technology for aviation. Marine, I think, is lagging. But we will need that, because the movement of goods and services, the huge container ships of today need to be replaced or have a different propulsion system, almost going back to where we began this conversation. So I think we know we have a time limit for that technological transition, for the transition of our economies between now and that new technology coming on stream. Trying to keep going in terms of our connections and our understanding of each other is actually vital. So we need to look at what it is we do to offset our carbon footprint. If we look at Prime Minister Johnson's speech at UNGA overnight, I think it was 11 a.m. our time here in Australia. He summarized it in typical Boris Johnson way: cars, coal, cash, and trees. And, cars going back to electric vehicles, but the other transportation technology that will need to have to come through. transitioning away from coal, and indeed the cash that we need for green finance. And of course, what we do on deforestation, replanting, returning natural habitat. Those are all the things that we can and must do as we find a way to keep people connected and understand who we are today.
How do we use our, earlier in the seminar I said, we are complex peoples, each of us. As Melissa Lukashenko, who's a First Nations Australian author, in the last session often uses the phrase, we contain multitudes. I'm very interested in the comparisons between the multicultural experience in Australia and Britain. How do we harness our diversity of people and perspectives to find solutions to these wicked questions? Vicky, what do you think? Do you think that there's an asset there that we each as complicated peoples have?
Well, part of the reason why we have this event as part of a wider UK-Australia season is to really recognise each other for who we are today. And, we are now both very diverse, multicultural nations. Perhaps it's less obvious in a city like Canberra, but you go to Sydney, you go to Melbourne, you look at the large diaspora communities, the recognition today of the First Nations, you started by an acknowledgement of country. That history of Australia that predates settlement of this country or colonization, we need to see each other in our totality, in our history, over millennia in Australia's case, centuries in Britain in terms of our modern context and our relationship today. And of course, one of the legacies of British Empire is the huge diversity and different diaspora communities that we have in the UK that have brought huge richness to both our countries. The diversity of food, the celebration of that and its impact on culture. And, for myself, I was born in Malaysia to a Singapore Chinese mother, a Eurasian father via the Dutch burgher community of Sri Lanka. Yet today I'm the British High Commissioner to Australia. The perceptions of the stereotypes that we may have had of each other, frankly, is where we need to begin to get rid of those stereotypes and appreciate the richness of diversity. Because why do companies and businesses actively look at their diversity and inclusion agenda? Because we know when you have a diversity of opinion, perspectives, talent that you bring in, any organization and therefore any nation and therefore any bilateral relationship is all the richer for it because of the different views, the different experiences. And when you want, open liberal societies with a strong creative sector are the societies that deliver the best science, the best technology, and the best innovation. So if we want to move forward and kind of bring it back to the climate agenda, the more inclusive, diverse, the more you celebrate the difference and what that brings to the party, the greater the creativity of any nation, and the greater the creativity, innovation, and partnership between two multicultural countries, in my opinion.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And actually, all three Australians at this table are of diaspora communities in one way or another. So,
can I jump in, Natasha, with a thought about multiculturalism today? This is a sort of hypothesis that I don't know how much scrutiny it'll really bear, but I think the nature of what it means to be multicultural or to be an immigrant in either of our two countries now is actually quite different than it used to be. And if I could quickly illustrate this, and some of you will have had this experience given the age we all are on this panel. When I first lived in the UK in the early 90s, It costs something like £1 a minute to have a phone call with Australia. You know, a letter took 7 to 10 days to get there. The airfares were prohibitively expensive. And if you wanted to know what was going on in Australia, you had to sort of go down to Australia House, go into the library there and read a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald that was 3 weeks out of date. And that was literally the sort of connection you could have with your home country. And so at that time and all times before that, the sort of the act of moving overseas to live in another country, and we're talking about the UK and Australia here, but it's true of anywhere, I think, was an act of kind of leaving, very much an act of leaving your country and immersing yourself in a new country. Today, I mean, for all, you know, that Zoom is not, and social media, etc., are not a substitute for actually going back to Australia or going back to the UK if you're over there. The amount of linkage and not just to your sort of, you know, your kith and kin in Australia, but to what's happening in Australia and what the kind of zeitgeist is, what people are watching, what people are reading, what the, you know, you can watch the Australian TV still, you can keep up with the news, is really different. And so the way in which you're, and this would be true if you're a Nigerian in London or an Australian or from anywhere really, and you can move money between the two more easily, you can have bank accounts in both countries, all these things. That level of connectivity we have means that the experience of being an immigrant is much more, there's much more duality in it than there used to be, and there's much more, how to express it properly, there's a kind of, it's a much richer experience because you can continue to bring your Australianness, in this case, to your, if you want to your presence in London, and vice versa, than you ever could before. So rather than it being a kind of act of choice to move and be cut off, you have this kind of way to keep a kind of virtual leg in the camp, even if you aren't flying as often. I mean, the flying is, the going is still has its place, but it's just interesting that what it means to, you know, and the kind of bridge that creates between for the people that are practicing that and for the people around them is quite profound and possibly underappreciated, even at this point where we can't travel.
Well, I also think that the role of cultural products is quite underappreciated. So again, I remember going to London in '91 and a lot of English people I knew were watching, I don't know, Home and Away, Neighbours, blah, blah, blah. But I also spent a lot of time in Amsterdam, and my Dutch friends there were all watching Heartbreak High with Alex Dimitriadis, and they're kind of going, wow, you have a really cool multicultural country there. They thought the whole of Australia was like Heartbreak High, and of course it's not. But I think that's really, I think that's the soft power role of culture, which is why I love working with British Council, is never to be underestimated. So I have to go to Sally next, because Sally, how many years have you been in Australia now, Sally?
About 3.5, but my first experience of Australia was back in the 90s, when a friend moved to Brisbane, and I spent every Northern Hemisphere summer in Brisbane for about 4 or 5 years. And in fact, by the end of that, I knew Brisbane better than the city that I'd moved to at the start, which was Leeds in Yorkshire. But that was because, as Hans said, it was £1 a minute to phone home. We didn't have the internet. I didn't have a mobile phone. And so you just got on with it. Whereas my experience of moving here 3.5 years ago is very different. I have all the TV packages, I have all the sports packages. Being in Canberra, there are lots of people with the same accent as me. So have I really moved? I don't know. Even being sort of shut in Canberra for the last 18 months, it doesn't feel very, very different. I guess the one thing I would say is that certainly I've moved within a certain class dynamic. And I do think class and social mobility, the social class you move from and the social and economic class you move into, and the prospects for social mobility within the country that you move to, I think can be very different. And that says something about the sort of multiculturalism you get, whether you do get to exploit talent or not.
What do you think about that, Frank?
I think, you know, multiculturalism in both countries in a way has been or has felt quite defensive, hasn't it, in perhaps the last maybe 20 years even. There have been periods in Australia where governments have basically avoided the term. I mean, I remember serving on a state government committee, a state Labor government committee some years ago, where the term multiculturalism had basically been cast aside in favour of, I think the buzz phrase at the time was cultural diversity, which was meant to evoke some of the same things, but obviously, I don't know, not upset tabloid newspapers or radio shock jocks or something. They clearly operate in different ways. The multiculturalism operates in different ways in the two countries. I mean, Australia is a settler nation, if you like. It's a nation that has been utterly built on immigration. It has a really incredibly powerful, I suppose, narrative, especially around post-World War II migration. Now, of course, Britain has stories about migration too, but it hasn't been formed in quite the same way as a settler country, a new world country, if you like, such as Australia. And as Vicky mentioned earlier too, I mean, the whole place of Indigenous people within a multicultural society in Australia has always been an uneasy and difficult one. Many Indigenous people in Australia have rejected the notion of simply being considered a kind of ethnic group in a multicultural Australia. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of weakened the sense of multiculturalism as national identity in Australia, because that's how it was being pushed, I think, in the 70s and 80s. This was going to be, kind of the Australian national identity of the future. But I think that especially arguments around First Nations belonging, the relationship of settler and Indigenous people, I think has to some extent cut away some of the ground, if you like, the turf under a notion of a multicultural Australia. So I think, it's a much more problematic concept, I think, now for Australia in Britain's case against a very different sort of situation. I mean, clearly it's multiculturalism has had a much stronger South Asian dimension and ex-empire dimension in a way that I think has been a part of the story of that diversity, that multiculturalism in Britain. It's quite different from the Australian situation. So I think there are some really important nuances there, of difference between the two places.
So I have to move there because to ask Vicky, what do you think are the points of intersectionality between the British multicultural experience and the Australian multicultural experiences that you think are really significant levers for enhancing this question that we're raising tonight about exchange? Because it is people to people, but it's also about those larger structural relationships and the larger exchanges and trade in that fuller sense. What do you think are some positive intersections that you've already observed or seen?
Well, actually, many of the points that Frank made give us a different set of foundations in terms of our modern understanding of our respective histories and the formation of our modern nations. But where are the intersections today? I think, for me, they're still very much in the areas of where people collaborate and partner. But we better understand the realities of our environment now and our respective histories. So, the intersections are around trade, opportunity. What I think often gets misused when we talk about values, and I'm not talking about Western values, but universal values that are built around rights and what ordinary citizens of whatever background require for healthy societies. So when we build our relationships at a people-to-people level or at a business and trade level, how can we find those opportunities where we are genuinely inclusive? So if you take our free trade agreement that hopefully we will conclude in terms of negotiating, it is for us, being the first one that we will actually a bottom-up blank sheet of paper negotiation as opposed to the rollover agreements. How can this FTA with Australia be radically different to any other FTA? So the concept of a whole of economy, whole of nation opportunity, right through to diaspora-owned businesses, indigenous-owned businesses here, actually all-inclusive as well, that this FTA should reflect women and economic empowerment of women in it as well. Now, some of that, there are voices who say that's not in a traditional FTA, but we're saying times have changed and we don't want traditional. We want something radically new, a new model that embraces the whole of society. And I think for many ordinary people, I hope that that would be an appeal. This isn't about big business getting what they want out of it. We're equally interested in the S of the SMEs, in the different businesses and the opportunities for all. So that is a very rich scene if we're successful in concluding the detail of such an FTA, which there's the political will to do so. It will be a different trade relationship that we're looking to develop here. But again, I come back to sort of how we develop the solutions of the future, the focus on healthcare, making an advantage of our difference in geography and time zones, in research and analysis. Our day is your night and vice versa. Collaboration in our best research institutions with different seasonality opens up huge opportunities. We need to rethink the way we do things. We need to rethink the way that we connect with each other. And we need to think, how do we make a virtue of our difference in very real terms? How do we make a virtue of the things that we genuinely share and have common purpose towards? And how do we work together in this new, highly connected global world? Going back to the points that international travel and the experience of the other is fundamentally changed because we can gain so much insight and experience through platforms like this. And I think it's finding that point of difference and value addition where we find the new connections and intersections of the future.
Hans, you're at that coalface of writing into this relationship in a way every day. What are just picking up on the thematic that Vicky raised, what are the sexy spaces for our collaboration? Because it's been a really grim 18 months. Let's not pretend it hasn't been. We've all been, we've all had our understanding of how our workplaces, the economy works, pounded. Almost everyone I know has somebody in another country that they can't see, they can't touch, they can't hug. Where do we find, where are the really, really, the places that will give us sustenance, the kind of, and I mean by this, questions in relation to trade, business exchange. What do you see as the positive things that may be starting to emerge from this difficult time, or that may emerge in the future?
Yeah, if I knew, I'd probably be doing that and making a lot of money rather than just writing about it. But I think just to sort of pick up on the FTA for a second, and then I will answer your question. But I just wanted to make the observation that given that all we've been talking about the increasing multiculturalism of both these societies, I think it's been the case for a while now that it's not really going to be enough in the future for Britain and Australia to kind of rest on the laurels of the fact that we have this long-standing historical connection and lots of people have cousins and whatnot in Australia, and we kind of grew up on the same TV shows and things like this. These have been important sort of struts that have kind of drawn Australians to the UK in the past. But these days, I sort of wonder, if the US suddenly said, right, any young Australian who wants to come and live in New York can come and live in New York right now, would those people then sort of move there rather than go to the UK? And so one aspect of the FTA that's absolutely critical probably is the mobility chapter, as they call it, and how easy it's going to be for people on each side to go and live and work in the country of the other for a period of time, because I mean the natural advantage that the UK has is that London is such a compelling city for young people to live in. It's so cosmopolitan, it's so interesting when it's not under lockdown, and so that's there, but you know, it you know, and everyone speaks English, so you know, even if Paris or Tokyo said any Australian who wants to come here can come here, probably not that many would go because they're worried that they don't speak French or Japanese. So it's got this natural English speaking ties of history, but I think, you know, we shouldn't take for granted that that just means that it'll happen. Both sides need to think, if we really value this relationship, and if we really want those people-to-people links to kind of continue to underpin the whole thing, the student stuff needs to continue, and the kind of young worker stuff needs to continue. And you know, it's partly a demand question as well as a supply question, but we need to make the supply side as easy as possible. In terms of what sort of areas, it's sort of funny at the moment, because when I first started doing this job about 3 years ago, it was quite easy to see this stuff, because you just saw, you know, so many Australian trade delegations coming through here, or so many British people sort of coming to me saying, oh, this is what we want to do in Australia. And you could see that all the time. But at the moment, because of the lack of travel, actually, I see a bit less of that sort of, you know, people aren't getting in touch with me because they're not sort of coming here and going, oh, while I'm in London, can I say hello? But the one that obviously jumps out, I'm sure Vicky would agree with this, is the sort of financial and fintech side. It is there's been a lot of effort put in by both governments to make cooperation in that area possible, and I still even now see quite a lot of people hoping to sort of take advantage of the similarity of regulatory frameworks and the similarity of and you know, what mobility options there are and the kind of ability to raise capital in each other's countries to sort of create cross-cultural sort of cross-economy fintech bridges, or run a fintech in each other's country. I've even seen one where someone started a company in the UK and then moved it out to Australia, and they're now kind of re-exporting it to the UK again. Besides that, which, you know, perhaps, you know, if that doesn't kind of really pull the chain so much, the kind of green economy stuff could get quite interesting as well. I mean, all the state governments here are really pushing the kind of hydrogen thing, and kind of, you know, looking to the UK and to Europe as well to sort of work out how Australia can kind of play itself into the need for not just hydrogen, but all these rare earths. I mean, it's sort of a bit old economy in a way, you know, in a funny way. It's sort of new economy meets old economy. Australia continuing to be a place where resources and energy, you know, gets dug out of the ground and taken somewhere else, but in a slightly different way. I mean, you're starting to see Australian companies who are getting it out of the ground somewhere, whether it's in Australia or somewhere else, but then processing it in the UK and then exporting it to Europe or even back to Australia. So there's a lot of kind of buzz around that kind of green energy, green resources, electric kind of rare earths type of space as well. Yeah, maybe that's a starting point anyway.
That's really good, because that steps into this whole question of the smart sector. And I'd be fibbing if I didn't say that a lot of the really, really, really smart Australians I know don't live here anymore because they haven't been able to find the kind of work that they really want to do. So a lot of them live in Hong Kong, London, Brussels, wherever. So I want to ask Sally about that, because, you know, at ANU you are one of the institutions who has the very significant responsibility of training up people to be equipped to operate in the smart sector. What are your views about that, and how, and the kind of sectors beyond fintech perhaps that young Australians might be attracted to? And will they be able to stay here? Will they need to go? Can they have a blended professional and personal habitation, if you like? It's a lot of questions. But
so I think one of the things that is difficult for young Australians is regulatory structures and mutual recognition of qualifications. So they finish university here, they fancy a period of time in Europe, and then maybe they qualify to do something. They get a professional qualification in Europe. Bringing it back to Australia is not that easy. And we see a lot of UK lawyers coming over here to work in the energy sector, to work in the arbitration sector and the large law firms in Sydney and Melbourne, but they can't do Australian work. They're very restricted in what they can do because we don't have a mutual recognition of qualification structure. That, I think, would be a game changer for a lot of people. They would be able to move seamlessly between jurisdictions. Businesses, again, regulatory alignment. Quite often we do things that are similar, but we don't necessarily recognize how similar they are in the regulatory space. If we did, that too would be a game changer, I think.
Okay, so maybe that could go in an FTA, Vicky.
I hope it is.
Can I
Well,
just say, just a quick insertion. If we had mutual recognition of lawyer qualifications and it was easier for lawyers to move, I think we'd be saying, well, the last lawyer to leave Australia, please turn out the lights, because the salaries here are like astronomically higher than they are in Australia. So there'd be a stampede, quite terrifying.
I'm not convinced about that, actually. The one thing you get introduced to once you arrive in Australia is something that I think the UK and parts of Europe, but particularly the UK, lost quite a long time ago, and that's the idea of work-life balance. I mean, here, work-life balance is important, and you do very much better for it.
Well, mutual recognition is definitely something we're looking at as part of the FTA negotiations. It is absolutely linked to the mobility chapter, because we want to see a good flow of talent in both directions, where you gain the experience in each other's jurisdiction that you bring back, hopefully at some point, to enrich your own society. And coming back to Hans's comment, this is precisely the point: complacency. We have history and there has been a rhythm to our relationship, but in a highly competitive world, we can't rest on, the strong people-to-people ties that are simply based on ancestral connections or familial connections between our two countries. Both our countries are far more diverse, with increasing diaspora communities. We need to find the new people-to-people links. That's why initiatives like the UK-Australia season is part of it, exposing our creative sector to each other in all its modern diversity. And the work that I'm leading with our own network here in Australia is reaching out and finding those new connections. So I'll give you a small example without being sort of specific on the individuals. I've connected with some members of the South Asian diaspora community, and certainly young people within it, who might be first generation Australians whose family migrated here from either India or parts of South Asia. And certainly speaking to some of the young women in those communities, trying to find inspiration for what integration, born in Australia but feeling slightly displaced, trying to find networks, given your more recent history of that type of migration, have found inspiration in the networks that we have in Britain, in our South Asian women networks that we have, that are long-standing, that are mutually supportive, that have huge celebrations in annual calendar events like the Asian Women of Achievement Awards in the UK, taking place at the Hilton, the Park Lane, that the great and the good come along to. And talking to some of those young South Asian Australian women, finding inspiration and a new connection with Britain to give them inspiration to create networks here like those Britain has had for 20, 30, 40 years. So when I say rethinking what our people-to-people connections are, rethinking what each country can do to inspire the other, finding those new dynamics and touch points, that's really important, because we need to find those new intersections, if you like, Natasha. But what is important to our people, where we don't have ancestral links or people to familial connections. So that's one example. In civil society, And right now, our young climate activists have never been so connected before. And that's because it's a global agenda issue that matters. And Britain's global leadership on that is also inspiring. So we have to work hard. We can't be complacent. We have to be creative and imaginative in terms of what our bilateral relationship offers and how we refresh and re-energize that all the time.
Yes, yes. It's like matrix to matrix almost. I love this idea because it's so horizontal, and it, to my mind, it disrupts a lot of very tired stereotypes about what the relationship is, which have been based on very calcified ideas of the class system and also pathways towards participation and excellence. So, Frank, I have to ask you about that because you're a Labor scholar, Labor historian. Could you say a little bit about the potential for creative and constructive disruption of those I'll call them imaginings of class between our two, am I allowed to call us federations now? clusters of many peoples.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's been, it's a whole image, I guess, of Britain as indeed not just Britain and Europe as kind of class-ridden, and you know, Australia as a new world society that was more egalitarian, all the rest of it. But you know, I think that the mutual images, you know, certainly the last 50 years, I think have been much richer than that and much more complex. I mean, some of those older ones are still there and some of them still have meaning. But, you know, I'm struck by, I suppose it's a point really that Vicky was making around civil society, the interest, the mutual interest in policy learning. You know, there are many examples of this. Think of the ways in which higher education policy in the two countries has developed, where you've had, you know, British ideas have been picked up here, Australian ideas have sometimes been picked up in the United Kingdom. You know, something like income contingent fees being an example, and a very famous example of that. I was struck certainly in the period I was living in Britain, and also, I suppose, the period of about 10 years before that, where I visited, and in fact, had an earlier stint there, how much discourse, how much conversation there was actually around shared policy ideas. And this also comes back to the sheer richness of British civil society, which, rather like Hans's point about London as a draw card, I think is likely to just simply remain a draw card for the whole, certainly the whole English-speaking world. I mean, Australians, younger Australians in particular, perhaps Australians generally, will continue to go to Britain because of the richness of its NGOs, you know, the whole richness of that sector, the think tanks, the culture industries, the quality and importance of its universities. For all of those reasons, there will be continuing connection, and there'll be the kinds of new relationships, I think, that Vicky was talking about. I mean, the old idea of, you know, you sending your bright graduates to Balliol, you know, which is the kind of thing that, you know, the history department at Melbourne University did back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. I mean, that might be over, but, you know, I can recall sitting on many a scholarship panel in Britain for Australians wanting to come to Britain, and, you know, the attractions of working at a place like King's or LSE or Oxford, Cambridge, wherever, any number of universities, depending on what people wanted to do, remained incredibly powerful, and that isn't going to go away. That is not going to go away. One of my own students has just headed off on a Rhodes. All of those kinds of connections, some of them, you know, going back a century or more, others of more recent vintage, I think will continue, and they'll be renewed, and we'll see different configurations. We'll see different kinds of person-to-person connections as a part of that. I think here of yes, I mean, climate change has been mentioned again. interest around Indigenous health and politics, all these kinds of things, will ensure that those connections are revivified, I think, as we go forward.
One more. Oh, sorry. Was that Hans? Somebody? No. One more question from me before we go to the audience questions. I'm often dismayed at what I think is Australia's collective illiteracy around language. We're, I think, astoundingly monocultural relative to the diversity of our immigrant communities. However, English is kind of it. It's the main game in Australia. To what extent do you think that provides a strong advantage around building our relationship with the UK? I mean, maybe that's an obvious question, but I just think it's, again, when I was at King's, I used to walk past the BBC and can't remember the exact words on the slogan, but it's something about relationships between the English-speaking peoples of the world. And similarly, the British Council has as its ethos building this friendliness between the English-speaking peoples of the world, of which there are many. How can we use that better or in a more sophisticated way? Actually, I'll ask Vicky that.
Well, I guess for us that falls into our public diplomacy or our soft power work that we do. I mean, the English language is a universal language. It is the language of tech. It is the language of medicine. It is the language of international law. It is something that the world wants. So I think how we deliver that and how we work with English-speaking countries to promote the English language is really important. But I think beyond that, it's not just about the English-speaking world, because that sounds exclusive to me. Learning other languages is really important. You know, for my organization, the British Diplomatic Service, we put a premium on the ability of our diplomats to be able to converse in the language of countries that they're in, to have the cultural competence and understanding, because after all, without that, we can't function. So, you know, I think Britain, more broadly, we have issues with language. We've been complacent because of the strength of English worldwide, that we need in this century and in the changing dynamic and coming back to the Indo-Pacific, we have to actually look at our curriculum at school. We have to encourage young people to look beyond the traditional European languages that we still teach and are more common in Britain. We need to look at some of the harder Asian languages, not least Mandarin or Japanese, for example. But there are some countries where actually having really good English also matters. I remember when I was preparing to go on a posting as the Deputy High Commissioner heading our team in Mumbai, I asked an old India hand, given that I covered 4 states, should I learn Hindi or Marathi, or perhaps I should learn Gujarati to have a bit more credibility? And he looked me in the eye and he said, amongst the people that you will spend most of your time to, the language that you need to work on and make sure is in top order is English, because they will speak better English than you grammatically and in terms of the range of their vocabulary. And actually it's true. There was an expectation as the British Deputy High Commissioner in Mumbai that my English should be beyond reproach, as my head of press, who was a wonderful Parsi lady, reminded me, Vicky, you must always speak the best English, otherwise people will think that Britain has gone to the dogs.
Can I come in this one as well, just because it probably relates to the subject of my essay in the Griffith Review, from which this conversation starts, which is that, of course, it goes without saying that having that common language and a lot of common frames of cultural reference as well is massively important, but it also offers there's a slightly deceptive thing about it, which is kind of what I was alluding to in parts of my essay, which is that it lures us into thinking we understand each other completely, whereas that's actually not the case at all, as I just have discovered over 13 years of living here and a previous stint, is that there are ways in which, you know, the way Australians approach, as a massive generalisation, you know, and it varies so much, obviously, between people, but there are ways in which Australians approach certain social situations and conversations and interactions that differ quite significantly from the way certainly middle-class English people approach them. And in fact, one thing that struck me living here this time and going to Ireland a bit is how much more the in the conversational humour social sphere, the kind of bedrock of Australian Anglo-Saxon culture kind of more resembles the Irish than it does, to me anyway, than the English in some respects. But it's not debilitating, you know. In business, you know, money doesn't talk a language in quite the same way. It's about risk and return, and it doesn't really impede Australians from having a great time here and enjoying themselves. But there are moments that you just sort of come across it and realise that there are sort of subtle differences that you hadn't quite appreciated from afar.
I'll have to ask Sally for a quick comment there, because she came to Canberra from Northern Ireland. So what do you think about that, Sally?
I think that Hans is right. I think there's a huge temptation to think that because we speak a common language, that we use language in the same way, that exchanges are structured differently, the way people interact with each other, talk to each other, speak to each other is very, very different in Australia. But the one thing I've learned of having an international facing academic career for 30 odd years is the huge parts of the world where English is not spoken. An awful lot of Central and Eastern Europe, English is not people's second language. Large parts of Africa, large parts of South America, you really need a very different language setting. And that makes you realise that, yes, that common lingua franca around English does create opportunities, but it also, I think, makes you lazy with language, and it shuts down an awful lot of opportunities that would be there otherwise.
Yeah, and I just have to throw something in there about how in many remote Aboriginal communities, English is very much a third or fourth order language. So that which goes very strongly to that particular challenge that we continue to face in terms of working out how we can all do it better. I'll go to the questions now. Daniel Bowden. The federal government's ban on UK citizens, specifically Australian permanent residents, leaving Australia for the last 18 months has had a significant emotional and mental impact, leading to many UK citizens returning permanently to the UK and others, like myself, considering the longer term viability of living in Australia without readily being able to travel home. How important is maintaining freedom of movement to our prosperity, and equally, how damaging are negative perceptions of lockdown Australia to future trade, immigration and business exchange between Australia and the UK? Thank you. And thanks, Daniel. That's a question very dear to my heart. So I'll invite anyone on the panel to answer it.
Can I say something on that, Natasha? I mean, I think it's a bit like the point I was making earlier about international students. The system to some extent depended on the ability of those students to move backwards and forwards. It wasn't like old-fashioned 1950s or 60s expatriates, you know, leaving Australia to go to Britain and coming back rarely, you know, effectively living overseas permanently, leaving your old country behind while remaining Australian, for instance. I mean, those sorts of patterns had very much, I think, dissolved, you know, in the age of jumbo jet travel. And, you know, I think people's willingness to work overseas has often depended on a judgment that you could come home relatively easily. And, you know, that kind of contract, if you like, has been breached by the Australian government over the last 18 months. Australians obviously have found themselves stuck overseas. Permanent residents and others living in Australia have been unable to go to their homes back in Britain, Europe, wherever. I think it's surely going to affect people's judgments about where they're prepared to live in the future. I mean, families, for instance, remain very important to people, and they need to be assured, they need to feel that in an emergency they can actually return home relatively easily. And, you know, yes, these have been very unusual times, but we don't know at this stage, you know, how easy that kind of travel is going to be in the future. I think that still remains very uncertain. And, you know, I think particularly the perception that Australia did too little to allow to facilitate the return home of people with Australian passports has been very damaging, not only amongst those communities, those Australian communities overseas, but probably more generally in terms of what an Australian passport means and the whole attitude, I suppose, of the Australian government to freedom of movement.
Would anyone else like? I couldn't agree more, Frank. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I will. I mean, I don't think anyone who has been prevented from going home, going to family funerals and things like that probably realises quite how difficult the last 18 months has been. And I do think it's the case that we are starting to be seen as the hermit kingdom, Fortress Australia. And we're already starting to see, I think, that some things are moving on. People are starting to make accommodations around what is possible and what is not possible in a COVID era that don't really factor in complete border closure. And we do need to find a sort of a way around this. I know we're moving towards a roadmap around opening up and what that's going to look like. And I just hope that we get there sooner rather than later, because this kind of global citizen life, as Frank says, was possible when you thought you were no more than 24 hours away from some sort of family emergency. Now, when the Australian government gets to decide whether you have a family emergency or not, it's a different story.
I also think it's not just been the government. I mean, the conversations I have every time I meet an Australian in London, which is, you know, in my job pretty much all the time, you know, there's always a sort of conversation you have at the beginning about this issue, and, you know, when are you going back, or what's the latest, you know, swapping intelligence and so on. And I think it's not just the government. There's quite a lot of surprise in the Australian community here about the attitude of Australians in general to this. And it's not just Australia. I mean, if you poll British people, they too have quite large majorities in favour of the idea of completely shutting the border during the pandemic. I mean, it wasn't practical for Britain to do so for a whole lot of reasons, but it was quite widely supported in the polling as an idea, even if it didn't happen. But I just think Australians here many have had difficult conversations even with their own families who've said, well, you know, I'd love you to come back, but actually I'd rather Australia was, you know, kept safe and the borders were shut. And those sorts of things are quite confronting to hear. So it's caused a lot of Australians who live in this part of the world to kind of reassess what they thought they knew about Australia and what they understand being Australian to be, frankly. And even if we do get back to some kind of normality, which I suspect we will over the next 12 months, I think that will linger in people's minds at this end, Australians' minds.
Yeah, you're not just in the UK. I mean, my family's in Europe, and I still think they literally don't believe that I can't come and see them. But they just kind of go, how can it possibly be? How can a government close its borders like that? Aren't you citizens? So we could spend 3 hours talking about that, but I won't. Would anyone like to add to that? Because that's a very difficult one, and I'm just really hopeful that something will give pretty soon. I'll come to something easier, which is from Mark Kenny. Is it possible to view the AUKUS security alliance, somewhat ironically, as a kind of surrender? A retreat to an understandable Anglosphere in the face of befuddling foreign complexity. PM Johnson essentially telling the French to calm down today, in bad French, had a sense of, look, this is serious, and in the end, we all speak English. I think I'll go to Hans on that one. since you're there.
I was happy I'm going to say Vicky. She can give us her version of franglais when she comes to this, maybe. I'm not quite sure how to answer that one in a way. I mean, there are a lot of different sort of, geopolitical theories flying around about what this all means, and who's just posturing and who's kind of serious, and so on and so forth. I mean, for what it's worth, I suspect the French are very upset, but also they are milking this to kind of get advantage of some kind or another. Who wouldn't do that in their position? But I hope when it all calms down that, and I'm sure Vicky would, I think she's already made this point, that it doesn't have to be binary on anyone's part. I don't understand why you wouldn't want France to be an integral part of the Indo-Pacific. They have territory here, they have troops here, they have interests here. I mean, why couldn't they potentially, be part of the Quad? Because they're part of the European Union, there are sort of complexities about how foreign policy is determined and who does what that make these things more difficult. And I'm just surprised that the Australian government has allowed this to kind of become, at least in the very short term, quite binary. I'm sure that and hindsight is a wonderful thing, obviously, but I feel like that we've created a binary we didn't need to create between the kind of Anglosphere and others, and hopefully it won't take long to kind of settle that back down and realize that we can all work together.
Would anyone like to add to that or answer?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important for us, certainly in the HE sector, to remember how important Europe is to us. I mean, the European Union has a research program that's worth 95 billion euros over the next 6 years, which Australian universities can be part of. We do a lot of work in the space sector with France. The co-authored publications at ANU for, say, Germany, that's our 5th biggest source country. And I think we do have to remember that for a lot of our academic colleagues, cooperation with European countries is outside the UK is really important. But I should also say that I don't know anything about nuclear physics, and I don't know anything about subs and that kind of military strategic space. So
Would Frank or Frank?
Yeah, I want to make about, in terms of public debate and commentary in Australia, I've been struck by the way in which this has been seen, not so much as an Anglosphere affair, but as about Australia's relationship with the United States. I mean, I think that has been elevated in public discussion. There has been, as far as I can see, relatively limited discussion about what this means for Australia's relationship with the United Kingdom. And that, to me, is interesting. It says something about how Australia has understood its security now for a very, very long time. It's been primarily about the relationship between the United States as against the relationships with Asia, and how you balance those preoccupations out with trade, of course, insinuating itself into every aspect of that. At this stage, it seems to me there's been relatively limited discussion of what it all means for that older relationship, if you like, between Australia and the United Kingdom.
Shall I come in now? I feel that that's my cue.
Yeah.
Let me go back to what I said at the beginning. As we look to our place in the world, we look at where the big important strategic relationships are for us. And it comes back to my point about complacency in a long-standing historical relationship and re-energizing and refreshing that. So this is an example of us achieving a step change in our engagement on security and defense with Australia, but perhaps giving visibility to partnerships that people have forgotten about because we might have been eclipsed by others. So we're stepping out into the world in a way that we haven't now that we're outside the EU. But what I would also flag is that we are not the only ones. I mean, France has a strategic partnership with Australia, which remains there. You know, it wasn't just a submarine contract, France's relationship with Australia. And that's my point about this not being a binary issue. All the things that Australia and France were going to do together, they can yet do, and I'm sure they will continue to do when things calm down a bit. But I'm not the spokesperson for France or Australia. For us, in finding where we can work with Australia, where we can refresh, where we can re-engage, revitalize, that's exactly what we're doing. And that's my job, and that's the ambition of the British government. But it's not just here with Australia. I go back to our ASEAN Dialogue Partnership success in becoming the 11th dialogue partner, when normally there are 10 ASEANs and there are 10 dialogue partners. So, you know, that's evidence of our Indo-Pacific tilt, our accession, our application to accede to the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another example of that. The strengthening of the missions and posts that we have diplomatically in this part of the world. So I would put what we have just agreed with Australia and the US as part of that broader strategic picture of Britain engaging with this part of the world. The other hat I wear is as head of our Oceania network. And over the 2.5 years I've been doing this job, seeing the reopening of our diplomatic posts in Tonga and Vanuatu, and opening for the first time a resident high commissioner in Samoa. So, you know, this is Britain leaning into the Pacific, strengthening our footprint, strengthening our partnerships. And surely it is obvious that foremost amongst the partnerships we would seek to strengthen, not because this is an Anglosphere, and I reject that actually. These are partnerships where we know we can work together because they're based on trust and understanding and mutuality. Indeed, the kind of partnership we want to be able to pick up and resume after the initial grievance has subsided with France. I go back to my point about being the second largest contributor to NATO and Europe's security. So, you know, this is a new world that we're in. It is a fast changing world. It's where the pace of technology is driving strategic decisions on what it is we need to do on capability. And this is an example of that.
There's also an interesting sort of overlap, I guess, between strategic considerations and structural issues that, you know, for Britain at the moment, I would say, in terms of, you know, it's coming out of Brexit and the kind of role it's conceiving for itself, and the rise of Asia and how to respond, the rise of China, sorry, and how to respond to that. With a sort of a more sort of personal and political thing, which kind of ebbs and flows a bit. But just as an observation, I mean, I was amazed to discover when Margaret Thatcher died that after she was elected in 1979, within I think it was just a few weeks of her election, you know, and the Tories hadn't been in government for quite a while, she flew out to Australia and went to a cabinet meeting with Malcolm Fraser. I mean, this was how close the relationship was at that point. And then during the Blair period, you know, the Foreign Secretary didn't no Blair government foreign secretary went to Australia at all, and so anyway, so there are sort of ebbs and flows. Again, to I guess to Vicky's point about complacency, you know, you can go from something like that Thatcher incident to kind of the sort of almost sort of flatlining of that, at least the, you know, the kind of traffic between the two countries. But beyond that, at the moment, there just seems to be this extraordinary depth and richness to the political and personal contacts between the Conservative Party in particular and the Liberal Party. I mean, starting with Lynton Crosby, obviously, and the role he's played in Conservative politics since 2005 at least, and his personal relationship with Boris Johnson, and then moving on to Isaac Levido, who has been an advisor of Boris Johnson in the last few years and also of Scott Morrison's. When you go to Conservative Party conference here, apart from the last couple of years, obviously, you sort of bump into all sorts of Australians, including leaders of the opposition when the Conservative Party, when the Liberal Party was in opposition. It's incredibly, and there are a lot of Australians who've worked as advisors. I'm not sure that the flow goes quite as much the other way. I'm not sure how many Brits are working for, but for the Liberal Party, but that kind of really adds a sort of another level of sort of oomph to the way these things happen, and that's actually coming from the top now, because Boris Johnson is so invested in Australia personally as well as politically, strategically, structurally. And although there are like quite sort of strong connections between the British Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party, for reasons that I suspect there's a PhD thesis in, but I have no idea, even though there's a lot of kind of, they go and work on each other's campaigns and they do all this sort of thing, there's not been the same, it hasn't, at least in the Blair government, it didn't translate into quite the same level of strategic alignment and personal alignment that you're seeing right now.
Someone should work on it, because it's a really good question. Oh, is my internet, can everyone hear me? It's telling you I'm unstable because I'm in Tassie. I think that's a really, really interesting point. So, and here's a connected question from Dave Rourke. What is the appetite for sponsoring Australian applicants for roles in the UK currently, and how easy to anticipate in the COVID context? So this again, this people-to-people flow. Thanks, Dave. Anyone?
I don't know. I only ever have to do it the other way around, and it seems to work fine.
Okay.
I gather, I'm not the expert on this either, but I think, am I right in saying, and maybe Vicky knows the answer to this, that there's some aspect of the, there's in both countries, there is or was a labour market residency test. So you had to determine whether there was in this country, in Britain, you'd have to determine whether there was if there was an equally qualified British applicant and an equally qualified Australian applicant, you had to choose the British one. You had to, or if you wanted to choose the Australian, you had to demonstrate that there was no applicant of suitable quality from Britain before you could hire the Australian. But I have a feeling that might be being waived in the FTA, or doesn't apply, or has been changed, but I'm not quite sure. Which would again be a sort of big bonus for Australians looking to work here.
I don't have an answer for you because, of course, negotiations are still underway, but I can only give you the headline that we want as free a flow of people between our two countries. Whether or not that is the ultimate landing zone, we shall find out, hopefully, in a few short weeks' time.
A connected question from Pip at ANU. Does moving to another country create opportunities for social mobility that may not have been otherwise available?
I think a lot of that depends on whether English is your first language or not. I think it's much harder to get started. Certainly my experience of knowing people who've come to the UK when English isn't their first language, I think it is harder to get started. It depends very much then on the extent of your ties into your diaspora community that is there. But I don't know what it's like coming into Australia.
I once had a lunch with a French academic who was teaching at the University of Norwich. He was telling me about the incredibly complicated way he had to kind of divide. His wife and young child were still in Paris or Normandy or wherever he was from, and how difficult it was to kind of shuttle between Norwich and France, and what a kind of schmozzle it was. And I said, well, why are you doing it? And he said,
anywhere really.
Yeah, well, true. But he said because I just wouldn't have the same opportunity to get this kind of this particular kind of academic position in France. Everything is so stultified, and there's these rigidities about who you know and what schools you went to in France that would preclude me from getting this. But in the UK, I can do this, which is something up until that point I would have thought might be also to some extent true of a country that sort of fetishizes Oxford and Cambridge in the way it does. But I guess it's just an anecdote, but there is the capacity to kind of reinvent yourself, and the fact that your background is slightly less well understood, perhaps, that can work in your favour. Although by the same token, there is still in older generations of British people, English people, there can be a slightly sort of condescending view about Australians and the ways that they behave, which sort of fit into lower tiers of the class structure, such as it still exists. But most migrants have incredibly difficult experiences, I think, or many migrants have very difficult experiences fitting into a new society, and you wouldn't want to underplay that. But there is that sort of positive side as well, where the migrant story of getting away from what's constrained you, and in a kind of, you know, in a more fluid sort of world of another country.
And I do like that idea of being of reinvention, and then for me, what interests me, and this is where a lot of the work that George Megalogenis has done in Australia is very interesting in terms of what happens with the next generations, and what kind of traction do they get on the primary host country. A more technical question from Akshaya Kamalnath. Do you think there is a possibility of expanding the fintech model of regulatory cooperation between the two countries to other sectors, which is a theme that Vicky's already touched on? Would you like to talk a little more to that, Vicky?
Yes, well, we've used the FinTech Bridge model for our new space bridge that I had the pleasure of witnessing. Well, we had to do it virtually, otherwise the two ministers would have been together had it not been for lockdown earlier this year. So the space bridge is the latest one off the rank. And our ambition in the next year or two is to look at maybe a cyber bridge, a health bridge. These are areas of, you know, development where we see real opportunity, but we're keeping our minds open on how we can use that model in other areas. But that's the ambition. Hopefully the FTA and some of the sort of regulatory work that we have to do around that will open things up, that we don't need a special vehicle like a FinTech Bridge to actually create yet greater connections between different sectors. So we will see what the FTA delivers, and then if we need other vehicles to deliver new connections, that's what we will do. But can I just come back on the social mobility point? I think, you know, the diversity agenda or the inclusion agenda, certainly back in the UK, and I speak, you know, looking at what we're doing in my own organisation, but across Whitehall, there is quite a sophisticated discussion underway now about social mobility. You know, gender has reached a new plateau. You know, look at the number of female ambassadors we have. All the Five Eyes countries now have female ambassadors as our heads of mission. Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, these are all women. So we feel that we have reached a threshold. We have a bit more of a way to go. We have looked at our Black, Asian, ethnic minority agenda and the work that we're doing to get people through to the most senior levels. But a realization that actually where we have fallen behind is social mobility and diversity from across the UK. Recruitment for Whitehall has been largely in the sort of southeast. So certainly if you're looking at what government is doing in Britain, social mobility and that diversification of where we recruit from, but also where you take Whitehall and you put it into the regions, which is very much part of the levelling up agenda. And in a way, the levelling up agenda in the UK is about reaching out to communities that have felt disconnected from decision making and the economic growth that we have seen, particularly in London and the southeast. So we're going through a transition in Britain, if those couple of examples are helpful, of how do we really create opportunity for all in quite a different way.
Well, that's a really perfect note on which to end. These beautiful metaphors of building bridges and levelling up. I think huge thanks to the British Council and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for enabling this conversation. I think we need more of these conversations so that we can continue to drill down in our understandings of not just where we are, but where we're all going together. A special extra thanks to Griffith Review and to the Australian National University for supporting the event. And big round of applause to our wonderful panellists, Hans, Frank, Sally and Vicky. And I'll just conclude with a comment from an anonymous attendee, which is headed, not a question, huge thanks for this incredible forum and for sharing your thoughts, and I second that. Thank you, everybody. The event was recorded and will be available online so that you can watch it again or share with your friends and colleagues. And I look forward to seeing where we're all going to go together next. Thank you.
Thank you very much.